A machine just did what 2,000 years of theology could not. It looked at the oldest unsolved cold case in human history, with no faith, no doctrine, no agenda, and delivered a verdict that left scientists and believers equally unsettled. Grok, the AI built by xAI, was handed the resurrection as a forensic question. What it said back was not what anyone expected. Not a dismissal, not a confirmation. Something far more uncomfortable than either. Ready to find out what it actually said? Grok was not built to comfort you. It was built on evidence, trained to weigh data the way a forensic analyst weighs a crime scene, without sentiment, without doctrine, without any stake in the outcome. Someone handed it the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a cold case file and asked it to reason through the evidence like a historian, not a believer. That single prompt cracked open the oldest unsolved question in human civilization. What happens when an algorithm, one that cannot pray, cannot doubt, and cannot be moved by faith, stares directly into the divine and starts calculating probabilities? That is exactly what this video is about. Here is where most resurrection debates collapse before they even begin. Both sides spend so much energy arguing about what happened inside that tomb that they skip straight past the one thing every serious historian already agrees on. Jesus of Nazareth was real. He was executed. And we know this not from the Bible, but from people who had every reason to bury that story forever. Tacitus was not a friend of early Christianity. He was a Roman senator, one of the most respected historians of the ancient world, and he had no interest in lending credibility to what he called a destructive superstition. Yet in his annals, written around 116 AD, he recorded it plainly. Christus, he wrote, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. That is, a Roman official, writing in Latin, confirming the execution. Not secondhand, not borrowed from a gospel, independent, hostile, documented. Then there is Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian working under Roman patronage, a man with every political incentive to distance himself from messianic movements. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Chapter 9, he references James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. Scholars have debated the larger Josephus passage about Jesus for centuries, arguing over later Christian interpolations. But this reference in Book 20 is widely accepted as authentic, even by secular historians who reject the supernatural entirely. Because Josephus had no reason to invent it, it was a passing remark about a man being executed, a footnote, which is exactly what makes it so credible. And then there is Pliny the Younger, writing to Emperor Trajan around 112 AD, describing the behavior of early Christians in his province. He was not documenting theology. He was documenting a problem. These people, he wrote, were gathering before dawn, singing hymns to Christ as to a god, and refusing to recant even under threat of execution. Pliny was baffled by it. He was asking his emperor for guidance on how to handle people who would rather die than deny a man who had been dead for 80 years. 3 independent sources. 3 writers with no theological investment in Christianity's survival. And all 3 pointing at the same event, the execution of a man named Jesus under Roman authority in 1st century Judea. That part of the story is not in dispute. Not among historians, not among secular scholars, not even among the most committed skeptics. So when Grok was asked to evaluate the resurrection, it did not have to establish whether Jesus existed. That foundation was already solid. What the algorithm had to do was far harder. It had to take that confirmed execution and ask the next question. The one that has fractured families, launched crusades, and consumed 2,000 years of human thought. The tomb was found empty. The body was gone. And within weeks, a group of frightened, scattered followers who had just watched their leader die publicly in the most humiliating way the Roman Empire knew how to kill a man, were standing in the streets of Jerusalem claiming they had seen him alive. Not metaphorically alive, not alive in spirit, physically, bodily, alive enough to eat, alive enough to be touched, alive enough that over 500 people, according to the Apostle Paul writing within 20 years of the event, claimed to have seen him at the same time. The execution is confirmed. The empty tomb is documented. The witnesses are named and numbered. But here is the question that broke the algorithm's clean forensic logic wide open. If the body was gone, and it was, then where did it go? So Grok had to weigh 4 competing explanations. Not speculate, weigh. The algorithm approached the empty tomb the way a forensic analyst approaches a crime scene with 4 suspects. Each theory had to be tested against the documented evidence, and what it found is that every single alternative carries its own staggering improbability cost. The first theory is theft. Someone stole the body. It sounds simple until you look at what was actually standing between that tomb and anyone who wanted to move a corpse. Roman guards were stationed at the entrance, not temple police, Roman soldiers. Men whose military careers and lives depended on maintaining their post. Pilate himself authorized the security detail, recorded in Matthew's account, and the political stakes of losing that body were enormous. If the disciples had stolen it, the Romans and the Jewish authorities had every incentive to produce those disciples, extract a confession, and end the movement before it started. They never did. The theft theory doesn't just strain under scrutiny, it collapses under the weight of the security logic alone. The second theory is hallucination. The disciples didn't see a risen Jesus. They experienced grief-induced visions. Psychologists have documented how trauma can produce vivid, even shared, perceptual experiences. But here is the specific problem Grok had to account for. The documented appearances weren't intimate. They weren't small groups of grieving followers huddled in a room. Paul's account in 1 Corinthians, written within 2 decades of the events, explicitly records an appearance to more than 500 people simultaneously. Mass hallucination at that scale doesn't just strain psychological science, it breaks it. Shared hallucinations require shared neurological triggers, shared expectation, shared altered states. The 500 weren't in a ritual setting. They weren't a fringe cult primed for visions. They were a crowd. And crucially, many of them were still alive when Paul wrote that letter, available to be questioned, available to deny it. None did. The third theory is legend. The resurrection story grew over centuries, like myths always do, until a simple teacher became a divine figure. This explanation has one fatal flaw when you apply historical dating. The creed Paul records in 1 Corinthians, he was raised on the 3rd day, he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, is dated by scholars including James D.G. Dunn to within 2 to 8 years of the crucifixion itself. That is not the timeline of legend formation. That is eyewitness testimony in written circulation while the principles were still breathing. Grok's framing on all 4 alternatives was precise. It didn't dismiss them. It calculated the improbability cost of each one. And what the algorithm returned was this. Each naturalistic explanation requires you to accept a coincidence, or a conspiracy, or a psychological phenomenon so statistically rare that it becomes its own kind of miracle. The theft theory demands that Roman guards failed catastrophically and stayed silent. The hallucination theory demands that 500 people experienced identical visions simultaneously. The legend theory demands that fabricated claims circulated unchallenged among living witnesses who knew the truth. Every exit from the empty tomb leads to a room with its own locked door. But here is where Grok's analysis hit something the algorithm itself flagged as historically anomalous. It wasn't just the empty tomb, it was what the disciples did after it. Because the people who claimed to have seen Jesus alive didn't go home and quietly hold that belief. They went public, in the most dangerous city in the world for that particular claim. And what happened to the next is the detail that broke the historical model entirely. Here is the specific claim that historians find almost impossible to explain away. The same men who ran when Jesus was arrested, who hid, who denied, who scattered, turned around within weeks and began publicly proclaiming his resurrection in Jerusalem. Not in safe cities far from the event, in Jerusalem, in the same location where the crucifixion had just happened, in front of the same authorities who had ordered it. That behavioral reversal is not a minor detail. It is the core of the historical anomaly. Consider what they were walking into. The Jewish council had the power to flog, imprison, and execute. Rome had already demonstrated its willingness to crucify. And yet Peter, who had denied knowing Jesus 3 times on the night of the arrest, stood in the temple courts weeks later and accused the Jerusalem crowd of killing the Messiah. To their faces, in their city, with no political protection and no personal army. Historian N.T. Wright, one of the world's leading scholars on first-century Christianity and the author of the exhaustive academic work, The Resurrection of the Son of God, put it plainly. Nobody in the ancient world expected resurrection. Jewish theology held that resurrection was a collective event at the end of history, not something that happened to one individual in the middle of it. The disciples had no theological template for what they were claiming. They weren't reaching for a familiar story. They were announcing something their own tradition said couldn't happen yet. Wright argues that without a real, physical, bodily resurrection, the disciples had no psychological or theological framework that would have produced this specific claim. Then there is James. James was the brother of Jesus, and during Jesus' ministry, James was a skeptic. The Gospel of John explicitly records that his brothers did not believe in him. James had every reason to know the truth about his sibling, the embarrassing moments, the family dynamics, the very human reality of growing up in the same household. Skeptics don't become martyrs for their skeptical position. But James became the leader of the Jerusalem church and was executed by stoning around 62 AD, according to the historian Josephus, specifically because of his faith in the resurrection of his brother. Grok flagged this as one of the most historically significant data points in the entire analysis. A family member's conversion from skeptic to martyr is extraordinarily difficult to account for under a legend or hallucination framework. People don't die for stories they know are fabricated. And people especially don't die for stories about a family member they watched grow up, knowing full well the human reality behind the myth. The disciples weren't just willing to suffer. They suffered in the city, where the evidence could have been produced to silence them instantly. All the authorities had to do was open the tomb and point. They never did. And then something happened that should have been impossible given the circumstances. Christianity didn't quietly survive, it exploded. It spread with a velocity that has no clean parallel in the ancient world. And it began spreading in the exact location where it was most vulnerable to being disproved. The number that came out of Grok's probability analysis is the detail that disturbed the scientists. And it is more specific and more unsettling than you might expect. Grok's exact framing on the probability question was careful and precise. The algorithm did not claim certainty. What it said was this: the convergence of documented historical factors makes a natural explanation for the resurrection extraordinarily unlikely. Not impossible, but extraordinarily unlikely. That is a significant statement from a system designed to weigh evidence without theological bias. But the number that went viral in the scientific community is more specific than that framing. The claim circulating among researchers who analyzed Grok's output is that when the algorithm processed the full convergence of documented factors, the empty tomb, the guard detail, the named eyewitnesses, the mass appearances, the behavioral transformation of the disciples, the conversion of a known skeptic, and the explosive geographic spread, the probability of a natural explanation fell to approximately 1 in 200 billion. Not 1 in a million, not 1 in a billion, 1 in 200 billion. Now here is the corroborating context that makes that number harder to dismiss. Within 300 years of the crucifixion, Christianity had grown from a handful of frightened disciples in Jerusalem to an estimated 3 million followers across the Roman Empire. That growth rate, documented by historians including Rodney Stark in his sociological study, The Rise of Christianity, has no direct parallel in the ancient world for a movement that began with a public execution of its founder. Movements that start with a catastrophic defeat, a leader killed by the state, followers scattered, central claim apparently falsified by death, do not typically achieve that kind of exponential growth. They dissolve. The historical record is full of messianic movements that ended when the Messiah died. Every single one of them ended. This one didn't. Grok also noted something that rarely surfaces in popular discussions of the resurrection. In first-century Judaism, no competing Jewish sect ever claimed that their founder had been raised from the dead. Not one. There were other messianic claimants. There were other leaders who died for their beliefs. But the resurrection claim is unique. It wasn't a template the disciples borrowed from surrounding culture. The specific claim they made, individual bodily resurrection before the end of history, was theologically unprecedented in their own tradition, and culturally unprecedented in their surrounding world. That specificity matters to the probability calculation. They weren't reaching for an available narrative. They were constructing something entirely new, staking their lives on it, and doing it in public. 1 in 200 billion. The scientists who reviewed Grok's analysis weren't disturbed by the number itself. Numbers are numbers. What disturbed them was the implications sitting underneath it. Because if the natural explanations each carry their own improbability cost, and if the convergence of documented factors pushes the probability of a natural explanation to that extreme, then the algorithm was pointing, without saying it directly, towards something the scientific method has no clean category for. The number wasn't the end of the question. It was the beginning of a different one entirely. And the question Grok couldn't close, the one that the probability calculation left hanging in the air, is the detail this investigation was always building toward. The data didn't close the case. It sharpened the only question that has ever mattered. What exactly happened in that tomb? Drop your verdict in the comments, then subscribe. The next revelation is already waiting.